Daniel Camargo Barbosa, known as the Andes Maniac, left an indelible mark of terror in the criminal history of South America. Born on January 22, 1930, in Andes, Colombia, Camargo had a childhood marred by tragedies and abuse that many experts point to as precursors to his criminal life. The early loss of his mother and the mistreatment inflicted by his stepmother are often cited as factors that contributed to shaping his distorted psyche. Camargo's criminal career began in Bogotá in the late 1950s. Married to Alcira Castillo, he developed a morbid obsession with virgins, which led the couple to lure young women to their apartment. There, Camargo would rape them while Alcira immobilized them. In 1964, they were arrested for these crimes, with Camargo receiving a sentence of only 3 years, a punishment that would prove inadequate to curb his violent impulses. After his release, Camargo quickly returned to crime. In 1974, he was again detained, this time for an even more heinous crime, the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl in Barranquilla. This escalation of violence resulted in a 25-year prison sentence. However, the Colombian prison system proved incapable of containing Camargo, who managed to escape in 1977, fleeing to Ecuador and initiating a new and more terrible phase of his criminal career. In Ecuador, between 1984 and 1986, Camargo Barbosa unleashed a wave of terror that shocked the country. His focus was primarily young women and girls, many of them students or workers traveling alone. His modus operandi was calculating and cruel. He would approach his victims in rural areas or secondary roads, offering help or directions. Once he gained their trust, he would take them to isolated areas where he committed his atrocious crimes. One of the most emblematic cases occurred in 1984 in the province of Manabí. Stella Maris Cucalon, a 19-year-old student, disappeared on her way to university. Days later, her body was found with clear evidence of sexual violence and strangulation. Stella's father, in a testimony that captured the pain of so many affected families, stated, "My daughter had dreams. She had a life ahead of her. This monster not only killed her but destroyed our family." Camargo's series of crimes came to an end on February 26, 1986, when he was captured in Quito. His arrest was made possible thanks to the courage of Elizabeth Tellez, a 20-year-old woman who managed to escape his attack and alert the authorities. At the police station, Camargo shocked investigators with the coldness of his confession, detailing his crimes as if he were describing routine activities. Detective Miguel Angel Tobar, present during the interrogation, later reported, "He talked about the murders as if he were describing a normal day at work. His coldness was disturbing." This lack of emotion or remorse would be a hallmark of Camargo throughout the entire legal process that followed. During subsequent investigations, Camargo cooperated with the police, leading them to various locations where he had buried his victims. In the forest of Guayaquil, the remains of at least 53 young women were discovered. Each new discovery brought a renewed wave of horror and grief to the victims' families, revealing the shocking extent of Camargo's crimes. Camargo Barbosa's trial in Ecuador was one of the most notorious in the country's history. In 1989, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed by Ecuadorian law at the time. This sentence, considered lenient in the face of the gravity and quantity of his crimes, provoked widespread public outrage. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, a victims' and rights activist, expressed the sentiment of many by stating, "16 years for over 70 lives. This isn't justice. It's a bad joke for the families who lost their daughters." The perceived inadequacy of the sentence raised serious questions about the Ecuadorian penal system's ability to deal with such dangerous criminals. Many argued that cases like Camargo's required a complete revision of the country's criminal laws, especially regarding violent and repeat offenders. The public debate that followed led to proposals for legislative reform, although many of them did not materialize immediately. Camargo's story, however, was far from over. In November 1994, he managed to escape from Quito prison during the confusion caused by an earthquake. This escape, which exposed serious flaws in the Ecuadorian prison system, allowed Camargo to return to Colombia, where he soon resumed his series of heinous crimes. In Barranquilla, Colombia, between 1994 and 1995, Camargo committed at least 8 confirmed murders. One of his victims was Viviana Rodriguez, only 15 years old. Viviana's disappearance in January 1995 mobilized the local community in a desperate search. Weeks later, her body was found in a mangrove area, showing the characteristic signs of Camargo's brutality. Viviana's mother, in a testimony that captured the deep pain of the victims' families, said, "My daughter went out to buy bread and never came back. This man not only took her life, but he also destroyed ours. We live in an endless nightmare." This moving testimony illustrates the lasting and devastating impact of Camargo's crimes, not only on the direct victims, but on entire family circles and communities. Camargo Barbosa's criminal career finally came to an end on February 13, 1995, when he was captured in Quibdó, Colombia. His arrest was made possible thanks to the attention of a local fisherman who recognized him from wanted posters and alerted the authorities. This act of citizen vigilance highlighted the importance of cooperation between the community and law enforcement in capturing dangerous criminals. After his capture, Camargo was sentenced to 25 years in prison in Colombia. However, his sentence had an unexpected and violent end. On November 13, 1994, he was murdered in prison by Luis Masache Narvaez, the nephew of one of his victims. Masache stabbed Camargo multiple times, declaring that he was avenging his aunt's death. This act of vengeance brought to light complex discussions about justice, revenge, and the role of the penal system in society. The legacy of Daniel Camargo Barbosa is a deep scar on Ecuadorian and Colombian societies. His reign of terror exposed serious flaws in the public security and justice systems of both countries. The ease with which he managed to operate for so long, crossing borders and evading capture, highlighted the urgent need to improve international cooperation in security and criminal investigation. Dr. Ana Maria Saavedra, a forensic psychologist who extensively studied the Camargo case, offered a professional perspective on the criminal. Camargo Barbosa represents one of the most extreme cases of psychopathy we've ever seen. His ability to manipulate and his total lack of empathy made him exceptionally dangerous. This analysis underscores the complexity of Camargo's psychological profile and the challenges such individuals present to justice and mental health systems. The impact of Camargo's crimes went beyond the immediate suffering of the victims and their families. Entire communities were affected, with a climate of widespread fear settling in the regions where he operated. Many families changed their daily habits, restricting the freedom of movement of young women and children. Schools and businesses implemented additional security measures, reflecting a profound change in the perception of public safety. In response to the tragedy, several victim support organizations were created. Carmen Andrade, mother of one of the victims in Ecuador, founded the Association of Relatives of Victims of Violent Crimes in 1990. She stated, "We don't want other families to go through what we went through. We fight for changes in the law and for more protection for our children and young people." These organizations played a crucial role in advocating for legal reforms and improvements in victim support services. The Camargo Barbosa case also had a significant impact on police and forensic practices in the region. The need to improve investigation techniques and the importance of international collaboration became evident. As a result, there was an increase in investment in forensic training and the modernization of criminal investigation methods in several South American countries. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the ease with which Camargo managed to operate in different countries. This led to efforts to improve cooperation between police forces in Colombia, Ecuador, and other neighboring countries. Information sharing agreements and joint training programs were implemented, aiming to prevent criminals like Camargo from exploiting national borders to avoid capture. Camargo's legacy also extended to the field of criminology and forensic psychology. His case became an important study for researchers and professionals, seeking to better understand the mind of serial killers and develop more effective strategies to prevent and detect such crimes. Many universities and research institutes in Latin America included the case in their curricula, using it as a case study to explore the psychological, social, and legal aspects of serial crimes. In media and popular culture, the Camargo Barbosa case continued to exert a morbid fascination. Books, documentaries, and even dramatized productions were created, exploring different aspects of his life and crimes. This raised ethical questions about how society deals with the memory of notorious criminals and the risk of involuntary glamorization of their acts. Finally, the case of Daniel Camargo Barbosa serves as a grim reminder of the human capacity for evil and the ongoing need for vigilance and compassion in our societies. It highlights the importance of robust justice systems, effective policing practices, and, above all, the need to address the deep roots of violence and social inequality that often serve as the backdrop for such heinous crimes. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig, known as the Black Angel. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig, infamously known as El Ángel Negro, the Black Angel, is a figure that still haunts the collective memory of Argentina. Born on January 19, 1952 in Buenos Aires, Puig grew up in an apparently normal middle-class family, which makes his criminal trajectory even more baffling to many. Puig's criminal career began early doors at the age of 19 in 1971. His youthful and attractive appearance, blonde hair and blue eyes, contrasted drastically with the brutality of his crimes, which earned him the nickname, the Black Angel. This contrast between his appearance and his actions deeply shocked Argentine society at the time. Puig's first known crime occurred on March 15, 1971, when he and his accomplice, Jorge Ibañez, robbed an auto parts store in Buenos Aires. During the robbery, Puig coldly murdered the caretaker. This act marked the beginning of a series of crimes that would extend for just over a year, but would leave an indelible mark on Argentina's criminal history. In the following months, Puig and Ibañez committed a series of robberies and murders. Their targets were usually commercial establishments, and their victims were often employees or owners who had the misfortune of being present during the robberies. The duo operated with brutal efficiency, with Puig usually taking on the role of executioner. One of the most notorious cases occurred on May 24, 1971, when Puig and Ibañez invaded a nightclub called Enamor in Vicente Lopez. On this occasion, Puig coldly murdered two young female employees, Maria Cristina Marin, 16, and Ana Maria Dinardo, 23. The crime shocked the local community and intensified the fear that was already spreading through the metropolitan region of Buenos Aires. Puig and Ibañez's criminal partnership came to an abrupt and violent end on August 5, 1971. After a failed robbery, Puig murdered his own accomplice with 2 shots to the head while he slept. This act demonstrated Puig's cold and calculating nature, who did not hesitate to eliminate even his allies when he considered them a risk or an obstacle. After Ibañez's death, Puig continued his crime wave alone or with new accomplices. One of his most shocking crimes occurred on February 3, 1972, when he kidnapped, raped, and murdered a 16-year-old girl, Ibañez Flores. The victim's body was found in a field, with marks of sexual violence and 2 shots to the head. This crime, in particular, caused intense public commotion and increased pressure on authorities to capture the Black Angel. Puig's series of crimes came to an end on February 4, 1972, when he was finally captured after a failed robbery at a car dealership. During his escape attempt, Puig was shot in the leg by a police officer. His capture brought momentary relief to the terrified population of Buenos Aires, but subsequent revelations about the extent of his crimes would provoke a new wave of shock in Argentine society. Robledo Puig's trial, which began in 1973, was one of the most sensational in Argentine legal history. The defendant's youth and angelic appearance contrasted dramatically with the brutality of the crimes he was accused of. The prosecutor of the case, Dr. Julio César Stracera, later famous for his role in the trial of the Argentine military junta, described Puig as a being devoid of any kind of human feeling. During the trial, shocking details of Puig's crimes came to light. One of the witnesses, a survivor of one of his attacks, reported he smiled while shooting. He seemed to be having fun. This testimony, among others, helped build the image of Puch as a cold and remorseless killer, seemingly incapable of empathy or remorse. Puch's behavior during the trial only reinforced this perception. He often smiled or seemed bored, showing little or no emotion even when confronted with evidence of his heinous crimes. In a particularly shocking moment, when asked why he killed his victims, Puch casually replied, "It was easier than tying them up." On November 27, 1973, Puch was sentenced to life imprisonment plus an additional sentence of 165 years, 9 months, and 1 day in prison, the longest sentence in Argentine justice history until then. He was found guilty of 11 homicides, 17 robberies, 1 rape, 2 kidnappings, and 2 thefts, in addition to other minor crimes. Puch's sentence generated intense debates in Argentine society. Many considered it fair, given the gravity and number of his crimes. Others, however, questioned the effectiveness of such a long sentence for such a young criminal. Puch's defense lawyer, Dr. Mariano Cuneo Liberona, argued, "A sentence of this magnitude for someone so young is essentially a death sentence in life." After his conviction, Puch was sent to Sierra Chica Penal Unit 2, one of Argentina's maximum security prisons. There, he quickly gained a reputation for being a problematic prisoner. In the early years of his sentence, Puch attempted to escape several times, although unsuccessfully. On one particularly audacious occasion in 1973, he managed to saw through the bars of his cell but was discovered before he could complete the escape. Over the years, Puch became an almost mythical figure in the Argentine prison system. His presence in prison was a source of fascination and fear among other inmates and guards. A former prison guard, who preferred to remain anonymous, commented, "There was something disturbing about Puch. He could be charming when he wanted to, but his eyes, it was like looking into an abyss." The case of Robledo Puch continued to capture the imagination of the Argentine public in the following decades. Books, documentaries, and even a film, El Ángel, 2018, were produced, exploring different aspects of his life and crimes. This ongoing attention raised questions about society's fascination with notorious criminals and the risk of inadvertently glamorizing their actions. As the years passed, Robledo Puch became the longest-serving prisoner in Argentina. His long stay in prison generated continuous debates about the Argentine penal system, rehabilitation, and prisoners' rights. In 2008, after 36 years in prison, Puch became eligible for parole. However, he surprised many by declaring that he had no interest in leaving prison. In a rare interview given in 2011, Puch explained his decision to remain incarcerated. "What would I do out there? The world has changed. I don't know anyone. In here, at least, I have a routine. I know how things work." This statement sparked discussions about the long-term effects of incarceration and the ability of former inmates to reintegrate into society after decades of isolation. Forensic psychologist Dr. Hugo Maria Tan, who studied Puch's case, offered a perspective on his psychology. Puch exhibits classic characteristics of psychopathy. His lack of empathy, absence of remorse, and inability to form deep emotional connections are evident even after decades of incarceration. This analysis raised questions about the effectiveness of rehabilitation for certain types of criminals and the challenges they pose to the penal system. Puch's life in prison has been marked by periods of relative calm, interspersed with problematic incidents. In 2015, he was accused of assaulting another inmate, demonstrating that his tendency towards violence had not diminished with age. This incident reignited debates about how the prison system deals with long-term prisoners who continue to pose a threat. The case of Robledo Puch also had a lasting impact on Argentine legislation, partly due to the nature of his crimes and the age at which he committed them. There were discussions about lowering the age of criminal responsibility in the country. Although these proposals did not materialize, the case continues to be cited in debates about juvenile justice and public safety policies. Puch's family, particularly his parents, rarely spoke publicly about him over the years. In one of the few public statements, Puch's mother, who passed away in 2009, expressed her pain. "I don't understand how my son became what he is. Every day I wonder where we went wrong." This moving statement highlights the devastating impact that Puka's crimes had, not only on his direct victims but also on his own family. The victims and families of Puka's victims continued to seek justice and closure over the years. Maria Esther Fernandez, sister of one of the victims, stated in 2018, "The pain never goes away. Every birthday, every holiday, we feel the absence. Knowing that he is still alive, while our sister is gone forever, is a constant torture." These words underscore the lasting impact of violent crimes and the challenges faced by survivors and victims' families. In 2019, near his 67th birthday, Puch made an unprecedented request. He asked the Argentine justice system to release him so he could die in freedom. This request reignited public debate about his case. Many argued that, given the nature of his crimes, he should remain in prison for the rest of his life. Others questioned whether keeping an elderly man incarcerated, after nearly 5 decades in prison, served any purpose of justice or rehabilitation. Manuel Octavio Bermudez, known as the Monster of Charquito. Manuel Octavio Bermudez Estrada, a name that became synonymous with terror in Colombia, was born in 1958 in Genova, Quindío. Known as El Monstruo de Charquito, the Monster of Charquito, Bermudez left a dark mark on Colombian criminal history, with a series of heinous crimes that shocked the country during the 1990s and early 2000s. Bermudez grew up in a rural region of Colombia, in an era marked by violence and political instability. His childhood and youth remain largely a mystery, with few public records available. This gap in his early history raised questions about the factors that might have contributed to shaping his criminal personality. Bermudez's crimes came to light in the late 1990s, when a series of disappearances of young boys in the Cundinamarca region began to attract the attention of authorities. The pattern of his crimes soon became evident. He targeted boys between 8 and 16 years old, mainly from poor families or those displaced by Colombia's internal conflict. Bermudez's modus operandi was as calculating as it was cruel. He lured his victims by offering work on his farm in Charquito, a small rural community on the outskirts of Soacha, Cundinamarca. For families desperate for any income opportunity, Bermudez's offer seemed like a blessing. Tragically, it was the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. One of the most notorious cases occurred in 1999, when 12-year-old Juan Carlos Rodriguez disappeared after accepting a job offer from Bermudez. Juan Carlos' mother, Maria Rodriguez, recalled the fateful day. "He was so excited about the chance to help the family. I saw him leave with a smile on his face. If I had known, I would never have let my son go." Juan Carlos' body was found months later, revealing the horrors he had endured. As bodies began to be discovered, terror spread through the community. Authorities initially struggled to connect the cases, partly due to the rural and isolated nature of the region where Bermudez operated. The lack of resources and the complexity of Colombia's internal conflict also contributed to delaying the investigation. It was only in 2002 that police began to seriously suspect Bermudez. A boy who managed to escape provided crucial information that led investigators to Bermudez's farm in Charquito. The survivor, whose identity was protected due to his age, described in disturbing detail what he had witnessed. He seemed kind at first, but his eyes, there was something wrong with them. When we got to the farm, everything changed. I had never seen such evil. Bermudez's arrest occurred on November 19, 2003, after a meticulously planned police operation. When police raided his property, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. The farm, which seemed idyllic from the outside, hid chambers of horror where Bermudez tortured and murdered his victims. The police chief in charge of the operation, Colonel Jose Maria Cordoba, declared to the press, "In 30 years of career, I have never seen anything like it. What we found there is beyond human comprehension." Subsequent investigations revealed the shocking extent of Bermudez's crimes. Forensic evidence indicated that he had raped, tortured, and murdered at least 21 boys, although authorities suspected the actual number of victims could be much higher. The bodies of many victims were found buried on Bermudez's property, some in advanced states of decomposition. Bermudez's trial, which began in 2004, was one of the most notorious in Colombian legal history. During the hearings, horrifying details of his crimes came to light. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence was a diary kept by Bermudez, in which he coldly described his acts. The case prosecutor, Dr. Carlos Valdez, read excerpts from the diary in court, causing shock and revulsion among those present. He wrote about his victims as if they were objects, methodically describing the suffering he inflicted. The families of the victims had the opportunity to testify during the trial, sharing devastating stories of loss and pain. Pedro Gomez, father of one of the victims, stated in court, "He not only killed our son, he destroyed our family. Every day is a struggle to continue living." These emotional testimonies highlighted the lasting and comprehensive impact of Bermudez's crimes. Bermudez's behavior during the trial was the subject of intense psychological analysis. He remained largely impassive, showing little or no emotion even when confronted with evidence of his heinous crimes. Dr. Maritza Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who evaluated Bermudez, commented, "His lack of empathy and remorse is characteristic of severe psychopathy. He seems incapable of understanding the impact of his actions on the victims and their families." On December 12, 2004, Bermudez was sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed by Colombian law at the time. The judge, in delivering the sentence, declared, "The crimes committed by Manuel Octavio Bermudez are of such a heinous nature that no punishment seems adequate. This sentence is the maximum our law allows, but we recognize that it may seem insufficient given the magnitude of these acts." Bermudez's sentence generated intense debates in Colombian society about the adequacy of the country's criminal laws to deal with such dangerous criminals. Many argued that the maximum penalty of 40 years was insufficient for crimes of this magnitude. This debate led to proposals for legal reform, including discussions about the reintroduction of life imprisonment in Colombia. After his conviction, Bermudez was sent to the high-security prison of Combita in Boyacá. Reports of his life in prison are scarce, but prison officials described him as a solitary and reserved prisoner. A guard, who asked to remain anonymous, commented, "He rarely speaks to anyone. He spends most of his time alone in his cell. There's something disturbing about his calmness." The case of Manuel Octavio Bermudez had a lasting impact on Colombia, leading to significant changes in child protection policies and criminal investigation procedures. The Colombian government implemented stricter monitoring programs for people with a history of sexual crimes and increased resources for investigations of child disappearances. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, a children's rights activist, stated, "The Bermudez case was a painful wake-up call. It showed us the flaws in our system and the urgent need to better protect our children." The impact of the Bermudez case extended far beyond the judicial system. In affected communities, particularly in Soacha and surrounding rural areas, collective trauma persisted for years. Schools and community organizations implemented awareness and safety programs for children, teaching them to recognize and report suspicious behavior. Carmen Jimenez, director of a local school, commented, "After the Bermudez case, we realized we could no longer be naive. We had to educate our children about the dangers, as painful as it was." Colombian media played a significant role in covering the case, sometimes walking the fine line between informing the public and sensationalism. Investigative journalist Roberto Gomez, who extensively covered the case, reflected, "It was an ethical challenge to report these crimes. We wanted the truth to be known, but we also had to consider the impact on the victims of families and society as a whole." The case also drew attention to the vulnerabilities of Colombia's rural and impoverished communities. Many of Bermudez's victims came from families displaced by internal conflict or living in extreme poverty. This reality raised questions about how social and economic inequalities can make certain populations more susceptible to predators like Bermudez. Sociologist Dr. Alejandro Reyes observed, "The Bermudez case exposed the fractures in our society. He took advantage of the desperate needs of families who were already on the margins." In 2010, 7 years after his arrest, Bermudez gave his first and only prison interview. His words, cold and devoid of remorse, shocked the country again. When asked about his motives, he replied, "I didn't choose to be like this. It's simply who I am." This statement reignited debates about the nature of evil and the limits of rehabilitation for certain types of criminals. The families of the victims continued their quest for justice and closure in the following years. In 2015, a group of relatives formed the Association of Victims of the Monster of Charquito, dedicated to keeping the memory of their loved ones alive and fighting for changes in the justice system. Maria Lopez, mother of one of the victims and founder of the association, stated, "We don't want our children to be forgotten. We fight so that no other family has to go through what we went through." The legacy of the Bermudez case was also reflected in Colombian popular culture. Books, documentaries, and even a television series were produced, exploring the events and their impact on society. These works often raise difficult questions about how society deals with extreme evil and the memory of such heinous crimes. In 2020, with Bermudez serving his 17th year in prison, discussions emerged about the possibility of parole, provided for in Colombian law after serving 3/5 of the sentence. This prospect caused public outrage and renewed debates about the adequacy of the country's criminal laws. The lawyer for the victims, families, Dr. Jaime Martinez argued, "The idea that someone who committed such horrendous crimes could one day be free is unacceptable. This shows that our judicial system still needs profound reforms." Today, the case of Manuel Octavio Bermudez remains a deep scar on Colombia's collective conscience. It serves as a grim reminder of the human capacity for evil, but also of the resilience of communities in the face of unimaginable tragedies. The Monster of Charquito is not just the story of a serial killer, but a painful chapter that forced a nation to confront difficult questions about justice, child protection, and the persistent vulnerabilities in its society. O Vampiro de Niterói, Marcelo Costa de Andrade, infamously known as the Vampire of Niterói, is a figure that still haunts the Brazilian imagination. Born on January 2, 1967 in Rio de Janeiro, Andrade grew up in conditions of extreme poverty and neglect, a context that many experts point to as crucial in understanding his descent into the abyss of criminality. Andrade's childhood was marked by abandonment and abuse. Raised in a Rio de Janeiro favela, he was a victim of sexual violence at the age of 10, a traumatic event that, according to forensic psychologists, had a profound impact on his developing psyche. Dr. Ana Beatriz Barbosa Silva, a psychiatrist who studied the case, commented, "Andrade's history of abuse is a significant factor in his psychopathology. He internalized violence as a form of expression." Andrade's criminal career began in April 1991, when he was 24 years old. His first known crime was the murder of an 11-year-old boy in Niterói, a municipality neighboring Rio de Janeiro. This horrific act marked the beginning of a series of crimes that would terrorize the metropolitan region of Rio for months. Andrade's modus operandi was as disturbing as it was consistent. He targeted young boys, usually between 6 and 13 years old, from poor families. Andrade lured his victims by offering money or candy, taking them to isolated areas where he committed his atrocious crimes. The most shocking aspect of his acts was his delusional belief that drinking children's blood would keep him young forever. One of the most notorious cases occurred in June 1991, when Andrade murdered 2 brothers, aged 6 and 8, on the same day. The boy's mother, Maria da Conceição, in an emotional testimony recalled, "They went out to buy bread and never came back. I never imagined such a monster could exist." This double homicide deeply shocked the community and intensified the panic that was already spreading throughout the region. As bodies began to be discovered, terror set in among the communities of Rio de Janeiro and Niterói. Parents feared letting their children go out alone, and authorities faced increasing pressure to capture the killer. Detective Roberto Cardoso, who led the investigation, commented, "It was like hunting a shadow. He attacked the most vulnerable and disappeared without leaving traces." Andrade's series of crimes came to an end in December 1991, when he was finally captured. His arrest occurred after he tried to lure two boys at a train station in Niterói. One of the boys managed to escape and alert a guard, leading to Andrade's apprehension. When arrested, he offered no resistance and, to the shock of investigators, promptly confessed to his crimes. During initial interrogations, Andrade demonstrated a disconcerting coldness in detailing his crimes. Forensic psychologist Dr. Paulo Sergio de Oliveira, present during the confessions, reported, "He talked about the murders as if he were describing everyday activities. There was no sign of remorse or understanding of the gravity of his acts." This apparent disconnect from reality immediately raised questions about his mental state. Andrade's confessions revealed the shocking extent of his crimes. He admitted to murdering 14 children, although authorities suspected the actual number could be higher. The details of his acts were disturbing. He not only killed his victims, but also practiced necrophilia and, in some cases, mutilated the bodies. Andrade's delusional belief that drinking the victim's blood would keep him young forever added a macabre layer to his already horrible crimes. The Andrade case quickly became one of the most notorious in Brazilian criminal history. The media, eager for details, dubbed him the Vampire of Niterói, a title that captured the public imagination and intensified the already widespread fear. Journalist Carlos Oliveira, who extensively covered the case, reflected, "It was as if a nightmare had come to life. The idea of a vampire attacking children seemed extracted from a horror movie, but it was our cruel reality." During the investigations and judicial process, a disturbing portrait of Andrade's psyche emerged. Psychiatric examinations revealed a history of untreated mental problems, including schizophrenia and personality disorder. Dr. Marcia Nogueira, a forensic psychiatrist in charge of evaluating Andrade, stated, "He presents a dangerous combination of severe mental disorders and psychopathic tendencies. His disconnect from reality is profound, and his capacity for empathy is practically non-existent." Andrade's trial, which began in 1993, was marked by intense public interest and heated debates about mental health and criminal responsibility. The defense argued that Andrade was not criminally responsible due to his mental condition, while the prosecution insisted that he understood the nature of his acts. The case prosecutor, Dr. Ricardo Saraiva, argued, "Regardless of his mental condition, Andrade represents an extreme danger to society. He must be permanently kept away from social coexistence." In a controversial decision, the court declared Andrade mentally incapable of answering for his crimes. Instead of a prison sentence, he was compulsorily committed to a maximum security psychiatric hospital. This decision provoked mixed reactions. Many, especially the victims' families, felt that justice had not been served. Maria Santos, mother of one of the victims, expressed her frustration. "He took my son's life and that of so many others. How can he not be held accountable?" Andrade's internment at the Heitor Carrillo Custody and Psychiatric Treatment Hospital in Rio de Janeiro marked the beginning of a new chapter in his story. Within the institution, he became the object of intense psychiatric study. Dr. Luis Fernando Ribeiro, a psychiatrist who followed Andrade for years, commented, "His case is one of the most complex I've ever seen. Even after decades of treatment, he remains deeply disconnected from reality and potentially dangerous." Over the years, Andrade's case continued to generate debates about the intersection between mental illness and violent criminality. His story raised important questions about the effectiveness of the Brazilian mental health system and the capacity of institutions to deal with such extreme cases. Dr. Paulo Amarante, an expert in public mental health, observed, "The Andrade case exposed the flaws in our system. We need a more integrated approach that combines psychiatric treatment with public safety measures." Periodically, Andrade's case resurfaces in the media, usually around anniversary dates of his crimes or when discussions about his possible release arise. Each mention revives the trauma in affected communities and reignites debates about how society should deal with mentally disturbed criminals. In 2018, When rumors of a possible release hearing circulated, there were public protests. Roberto Alves, a victims' rights activist, declared, "The mere idea that someone who committed such horrendous crimes might one day be free is unacceptable." The victims' families still live with this pain every day. The impact of the Andrade case on Brazilian society was profound and long-lasting. Beyond the immediate trauma inflicted on victims and their families, the case exposed significant vulnerabilities in the child and adolescent protection system. As a result, there was a push to strengthen public safety policies and crime prevention programs for minors. Dr. Claudia Silva, an expert on children's rights, commented, "The Andrade case was a painful catalyst for necessary changes. We saw an increase in education and prevention initiatives, as well as improvements in response protocols for missing children." The communities of Niterói and Rio de Janeiro, epicenters of Andrade's crimes, underwent a long process of collective recovery. Community initiatives emerged to honor the memory of the victims and support affected families. In 2001, 10 years after the crimes, a memorial was inaugurated in Niterói dedicated to Andrade's victims. During the inauguration ceremony, the mayor of Niterói at the time declared, "This memorial serves not only to remember, but to commit ourselves to protecting our children and preventing such horrors from happening again." The case also had a significant impact on Brazilian forensic psychiatry. The complexity of Andrade's mental condition and the challenges in his treatment led to in-depth discussions about the approach to cases of criminals with severe mental disorders. Dr. Roberto Ticcanori, former National Coordinator of Mental Health, observed, "The Andrade case forced us to rethink our approach. It highlighted the need for closer integration between the criminal justice system and mental health services." Over the years, various cultural works inspired by the Andrade case emerged, including books, documentaries, and even dramatized productions. These works often generated controversies, with critics arguing that they risked sensationalizing the crimes and re-traumatizing victims. On the other hand, advocates argued that such productions served to maintain public awareness of important safety and mental health issues. Filmmaker João Paulo Rodrigues, who produced a documentary about the case in 2015, commented, "Our goal was not to glorify the criminal, but to understand how our society allows such tragedies to occur." In 2020, almost 3 decades after his crimes, Andrade's name returned to headlines when a team of researchers from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro published a detailed study on his case. The study, which analyzed decades of medical records and interviews, offered new perspectives on Andrade's psychopathology. Dr. Fernanda Mireles, leader of the research, explained, "Our study reveals the complexity of the Andrade case. He doesn't easily fit into simple diagnostic categories. His condition represents an ongoing challenge to our understanding of the intersection between severe mental illness and violent criminal behavior." The debate about Andrade's fate continues. While some argue that he should remain indefinitely in psychiatric custody, others question the ethics of keeping someone institutionalized for so long without the prospect of release. Dr. Carlos Eduardo Pereira, a human rights advocate, argues, "Even in the most extreme cases, we must consider human rights and the possibility of rehabilitation. The challenge is to balance this with public safety." The families of Andrade's victims continue to fight for justice and memory. In 2021, they formed the Association of Family Members of the Victims of the Vampire of Niterói, dedicated to keeping the memory of their loved ones alive and advocating for stricter child protection policies. Janaína Souza, sister of one of the victims and president of the association, declared, "We don't want our children to be forgotten. We fight so that their deaths were not in vain, so that other families are spared this unimaginable pain." Today, the case of Marcelo Costa de Andrade remains a dark chapter in Brazilian criminal history. It serves as a disturbing reminder of the dangers that can lurk in society and the ongoing need for vigilance and improvements in mental health and criminal justice systems. The legacy of the Vampire of Niterói is not just a horror story, but a call to action to protect the most vulnerable and address the complex issues that allow such tragedies to occur.